Welcome to another deep dive. Listeners have sent in some European news, Turkish language pieces, even some legal analyses, all centered around the recent passing of Fethullah Gulen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's interesting because his death is bringing even more attention to this story that's been unfolding for years.
Yeah.
With global implications, really.
It is fascinating to see how his passing is almost acting like a catalyst. He's been in self-imposed exile in the U.S. since 1999,
Right.
accused of that 2016 coup in Turkey and labeled a terrorist by their government.
Right.
But, even in death, the repercussions for his movement, Hizmet, they're massive.
Yeah, and the range of sources that we have really highlight that. We've got reports of a journalist in Turkey arrested for simply expressing condolences.
Wow.
Turkish citizens deported from Kenya, and even a Turkish official's book advocating for the execution of Gulen supporters.
Oh, wow.
Even though the death penalty has been abolished there.
It's a very stark illustration of how the Turkish government views this Gulen movement.
Yeah.
They label it F2, the Fethullahist terrorist organization.
Right.
And their narrative is that this group infiltrated state institutions and poses a fundamental threat to national security.
Okay, so for our listeners who aren't super familiar with this, let's back up a bit. Who was Fethullah Gulen, and what is this Hizmet movement all about?
Sure. So Gulen was a Turkish cleric and Islamic scholar, and Hizmet, which means service, promotes a moderate Islam centered on education, interfaith dialogue, and social work.
Okay.
It actually attracted a huge following both within Turkey and internationally.
Right.
But in 1999, Gulen went into exile in the U.S.
Right.
And that's really when the relationship with the Turkish government started to really sour.
So things kind of came to a head with that 2016 coup attempt.
Yeah.
Remind us what happened there and how did Gulen get tied to it?
So in July 2016, a faction of the Turkish military tried to overthrow the government.
Right.
It was a very chaotic night,
Yeah.
ultimately unsuccessful. But President Erdoğan immediately blamed Gulen and Hizmet, labeled them terrorists, and then launched this massive crackdown.
And the sources you've shared really paint a picture of the fallout from that accusation.
Yeah.
We're talking thousands of people impacted, teachers, journalists, judges, anyone suspected of Gulen ties,
Right.
losing jobs, imprisoned, or fleeing the country.
It's important to understand the depth of this purge.
Yeah,
It wasn't just high-profile figures. This went deep into Turkish society.
right.
The government claims that it was necessary to root out this dangerous network. But critics argue it was a way to just silence dissent and consolidate power.
So we have these two very different narratives clashing here.
Yes.
The Turkish government sees Gulen as the mastermind behind this coup, a threat that needs to be eliminated.
Right.
But Gulen's followers insist they had nothing to do with the coup attempt, that this is all just politically motivated. How have these narratives kind of played out, especially since Gulen's death?
Well, the Turkish government, even with Gulen gone, shows no signs of letting up. Their officials are vowing to continue pursuing his supporters wherever they may be.
Right.
And that arrest of the journalist simply offering condolences, I think speaks volumes about how tightly they're controlling the narrative within Turkey.
That's a chilling thought.
It is.
It seems like even expressing sympathy for Gulen or his followers is enough to land you in trouble.
Absolutely. And it really highlights that atmosphere of fear and self-censorship
Yeah.
that exists in Turkey for anyone even remotely connected to Gulen.
Right.
But we also need to consider the perspective of Gulen's supporters.
Yeah.
They feel victimized,
Yeah.
targeted for their beliefs and associations.
Right.
They see themselves caught in this web of political maneuvering, fearing for their safety, even beyond Turkey's borders.
It's like they're trapped in a no-win situation.
Yeah.
If they stay in Turkey, they risk persecution.
Right.
But if they escape, they're still seen as a threat by the Turkish government and potentially even the countries they seek refuge in.
Right.
It's like this isn't just an internal Turkish issue, it's spilling over internationally.
Exactly. And that's where we get into the complexities of the situation in Europe,
Right.
particularly the influx of Turkish asylum seekers, many of whom are Gulen supporters.
And the Turkish language sources you've provided, they offer a particularly interesting angle on this.
They do.
They actually focus on the skills and qualifications of these asylum seekers.
Yeah.
It's not just about fleeing persecution. It's about who these individuals are and what they bring to the table.
It's a point that often gets lost in the broader political narrative.
Yeah.
The sources we have emphasize that many of these asylum seekers are highly educated professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, with a proven track record of success and a desire to contribute to their new societies.
So while the Turkish government paints them as a threat,
Yeah.
these sources are presenting a different image. one of skilled individuals who could actually be a valuable asset to
Well,
countries like the Netherlands.
It's a very compelling argument. And we have that source specifically about the positive economic contributions of Turkish migrants, highlighting their entrepreneurial spirit and community involvement.
Right.
It's a much more nuanced picture than what's often portrayed in the media.
But it's not all rosy, is it?
No.
I mean, we also have sources detailing how asylum policies, especially in the Netherlands, are shifting in response to concerns about the Gülen movement.
Right.
It seems like there's a growing tension
Yeah.
between wanting to welcome skilled migrants and being wary of those potential security risks.
You're right. And that's where things get really complicated for these asylum seekers. Even if they can demonstrate a genuine fear of persecution, they're facing increasingly stringent policies and a heightened scrutiny of their affiliations.
We have that case of the asylum seeker whose application was initially rejected by the Dutch Immigration Authority, the IND, but then overturned by a court because the IND was accused of selectively using information to downplay the risks faced by Gulenists.
Wow.
It seems like a legal battle is brewing with real consequences for those caught in the middle.
That case is a prime example of the challenges these individuals face. How do you prove your case when the very information used to assess your claim is contested?
Yeah.
How do you navigate a system that's increasingly suspicious of anyone associated with the Gülen movement?
It sounds like a real catch-22.
Yeah.
And then to add another layer of complexity, we have that report from Germany about the discovery of a list with names and personal information of suspected Gülen supporters.
Oh, wow.
It's unsettling.
Yeah, it suggests that the Turkish government's reach extends far beyond its borders.
Right.
And that those who have fled may not be as safe as they thought.
Yeah.
It really raises the stakes for those seeking asylum and puts even more pressure on European governments to figure out how to balance security concerns with humanitarian obligations.
So even if they manage to escape Turkey, they might not be entirely safe elsewhere?
That's right.
It seems like this deep dive is turning into a real-life thriller.
It certainly has that element of suspense and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that this story is far from over.
Right.
Gülen's death hasn't provided any closure, if anything.
Yeah.
It's intensified the situation for his supporters and created even more questions about their future.
Okay, before we get too caught up in the suspense, let's pause and recap what we've learned so far. Fethullah Gülen, a very controversial figure, has died, but the repercussions of his movement and the accusations against him are still very much playing out.
Yeah.
We've got these conflicting narratives about whether he and his followers pose a genuine security threat or are simply victims of political persecution.
Right.
And then we have this whole other dimension of Turkish asylum seekers caught in the crossfire, many of whom are highly skilled individuals who could potentially benefit their new countries.
You've summarized it perfectly.
Yeah.
It's crucial for our listener to understand that this situation isn't black and white. There are multiple perspectives, conflicting information, and very real consequences for people on all sides.
Yeah.
This is a story about power, about belief, and ultimately about the human cost of political conflict.
And that leads us to the next part of our deep dive, where we'll delve deeper into that evolving situation in Europe. The challenges and opportunities presented by this influx of Turkish asylum seekers.
It's a topic that requires very careful consideration.
Yeah.
Especially as it touches on issues of security, human rights, and the integration of newcomers into society.
Stay tuned, we're just getting started.
Picking up on that point about Europe, the situation in the Netherlands, I think, is particularly interesting. It's a microcosm of the challenges many countries are facing.
Yeah.
How to balance compassion for those fleeing persecution with these concerns about security, especially given the strong stance the Turkish government is taking against the Gülen movement.
It's a tough position to be in. On one hand, you have these individuals, often with families, who've experienced real threats and upheaval. But on the other hand, there's this cloud of suspicion cast by the Turkish government, making it difficult to assess each case on its own merits.
And that's where I think the sources you shared get really insightful. The Turkish language ones in particular, they push back against this monolithic view of Gülen supporters as inherently dangerous. They highlight the diversity within the movement, reminding us that, the vast majority are peaceful, law-abiding citizens.
It's easy to forget that when you're bombarded with the rhetoric coming from the Turkish government.
Right.
I mean, they've been very effective at painting this picture of a shadowy organization bent on undermining the state.
Exactly. They point to those corruption scandals back in 2013, alleging that Gulen supporters within the judiciary and police were behind them. And of course, the 2016 coup attempt is their key piece of evidence solidifying that FETÖ label in their minds.
But the sources also highlight how this narrative has been used to justify a sweeping crackdown. Not just on those directly involved in the coup, but on anyone perceived as a potential Gülen sympathizer.
Right.
It's created this chilling effect with people afraid to speak out or even express sympathy for fear of being targeted.
That fear is palpable in the stories of those who fled Turkey.
Right.
They talk about being constantly watched, their phones tapped,
Wow.
their families harassed. It's a level of paranoia that's hard to comprehend unless you've lived through it.
And even for those who make it to Europe, that sense of unease doesn't necessarily disappear.
No.
I mean, we have those reports of tightening asylum policies, particularly in the Netherlands, which seems to be grappling with how to assess these asylum claims.
The Netherlands is facing a dilemma that's common across Europe.
Yeah.
They want to be seen as a haven for those fleeing persecution, upholding their humanitarian obligations. But they're also under pressure to prioritize security, especially given the rise of right-wing populism and concerns about terrorism.
It seems like that political climate is making it even harder for Turkish asylum seekers. Regardless of their individual circumstances, to get a fair hearing, it's like they're guilty by association simply because of their perceived connection to Gülen.
And that's reflected in those policy changes we discussed.
Right.
The Dutch government has become more cautious, placing a greater burden of proof on applicants to demonstrate a credible fear of persecution. They're scrutinizing every detail, looking for any sign of potential risk.
Which brings us back to that case of the asylum seeker whose application was initially rejected but then overturned by a court.
Right.
The court found that the IND had cherry-picked information to downplay the dangers faced by Gülenists, essentially skewing the assessment in favor of rejection.
That case highlights the challenges of navigating this politically charged landscape.
Yeah.
How do you assess an individual's claim when the very information you're using is contested?
Right.
How do you ensure fairness and objectivity when there's so much pressure to err on the side of caution?
It's a real conundrum, and it's having a huge impact on the lives of those waiting for a decision. They're living in limbo, uncertain of their future, unable to fully integrate or move on with their lives.
And then to make matters even more complicated, there's that unsettling discovery in Germany of the list with names and personal information of suspected Gülen supporters.
Right.
It raises concerns about the potential for espionage or even violence against this group, even beyond Turkey's borders.
That discovery really throws a wrench into things. It suggests that the Turkish government's reach is far greater than we might have imagined.
Yeah.
And that even those who have escaped Turkey may not be entirely safe.
Exactly. It adds a whole new layer of complexity to the situation, both for the asylum seekers themselves and for the European governments trying to figure out how to protect them.
I'm struck by the fact that this isn't just an issue for governments and policymakers.
No.
It's affecting real people, families who are being torn apart, individuals who are living with constant fear and uncertainty.
That human dimension is so important to remember. The stories we have access to through these sources remind us that behind the political machinations and the legal battles, there are individuals who are trying to rebuild their lives,
Right.
to contribute to their new communities, to find some sense of peace and stability.
It's inspiring to see their resilience and determination to make the best of a difficult situation. We have those accounts of Gülen supporters starting businesses, volunteering in their communities, pursuing their education, all while carrying the weight of what they've experienced.
It really challenges the simplistic narratives that often dominate the media.
Yeah.
These aren't just victims or threats. They're individuals with diverse backgrounds, skills, and aspirations. They're contributing to the social fabric of their new societies, enriching the cultural landscape, and proving that integration, while challenging, is possible.
And that brings us back to that source about the positive economic contributions of Turkish migrants.
Right.
It provides concrete evidence of their entrepreneurial spirit, their work ethic, their commitment to giving back to their communities.
Right.
It's a reminder that diversity can be a strength, not a weakness.
It's a powerful counterpoint to the fear-mongering and the divisive rhetoric that often surrounds this issue.
Yeah.
It encourages us to look beyond the stereotypes, to see the individuals behind the labels, and to recognize the potential benefits of welcoming newcomers into our societies.
So as we navigate this complex terrain, it's crucial to hold on to that sense of possibility, that belief in the power of human connection and the potential for positive change, even amid such challenging circumstances.
Absolutely. It's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, the political maneuvering,
Yeah.
the fear and suspicion that often dominate the narrative.
Right.
But it's important to remember that there's also hope, resilience, and the power of human spirit to overcome adversity.
And I think that's a good place to transition to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore those themes of resilience and hope and how individuals are finding ways to move forward despite the ongoing challenges.
It's a story of courage, adaptation, and the enduring human capacity to find meaning and purpose even in the most difficult of circumstances.
Stay with us. There's much more to uncover. It strikes me that this whole situation with the Gülen movement, it really comes down to this question of trust.
It really does.
We're constantly bombarded with information,
Yeah, right.
with different versions of the truth from governments, media advocacy groups.
Yeah.
And it's a lot to sift through, especially when the stakes are so high.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about these, abstract political ideas.
Right.
This is about people's lives, their families, their freedom, and the fear that many are living with, every single day.
And that's what I think makes this deep dive so crucial.
Yeah.
It's not just about presenting the information, but it's helping you, the listener, develop the tools
Right.
to navigate this very complex landscape, to understand the context, the competing narratives, the nuances that often get lost in the headlines.
It comes down to who you believe,
Yeah,
whose narrative you find more, compelling or convincing.
right.
And it's not easy, especially with something like the 2016 coup attempt, where there's still so much debate and conflicting information.
The sources you've shared really highlight that tension.
They do.
The Turkish government presents a very clear narrative. Gülen was the mastermind, his followers are terrorists, and they need to be eradicated.
Right.
But the Gülen movement pushes back, saying this is a politically motivated purge aimed at silencing dissent and consolidating power. And then there's that whole question of evidence.
Yeah.
The Turkish government claims to have proof of Gülen's involvement,
Yeah.
but critics argue that much of it is circumstantial or based on forced confessions.
Right.
It's a very murky situation.
Yeah. It is.
And it's hard to know what to believe.
That's right.
It's a challenge, and it's one that's playing out not just in Turkey, but also in countries like the Netherlands, where they're trying to assess asylum claims
Yeah.
from Turkish citizens associated with the Gülen movement. So how do you determine the validity of a claim when the information you're using is contested?
It's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, they want to uphold their humanitarian obligations
All right.
and offer protection to those fleeing persecution.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, they're also concerned about these security risks, especially given the strong stance that the Turkish government is taking.
And that's where I think those Turkish language sources you provided offer a really important perspective.
They do.
They focus on the human side of the story, reminding us that we're not just talking about, these abstract threats or political ideologies. They tell the stories of individuals who have been caught up in this crackdown, people who've lost their jobs, their homes, their families.
Yeah.
They highlight the fear and uncertainty they're living with, the challenges they face trying to rebuild their lives.
And they also emphasize the contributions that these individuals are making to their new communities.
Right.
The doctors, the teachers, the entrepreneurs who are putting down roots, starting businesses, and giving back to society.
It's a powerful reminder that there's another side to this story, one that often gets drowned out by the political noise and the security concerns.
Absolutely.
It's a story of resilience, of adaptation,
Right.
of the human spirit's ability to overcome adversity and find a way forward.
It is.
And it's a story that deserves to be heard.
That's right.
It challenges us to look beyond those stereotypes and the labels, to see the individuals behind the headlines, and to recognize the potential that diversity brings.
And I think that's a really important takeaway for our listener.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been about understanding the complexities of the Gülen movement, the competing narratives, the challenges and the opportunities that it presents.
It's been about developing a critical eye, learning to ask the right questions, and recognizing that there are rarely easy answers when it comes to issues like this.
And ultimately, it's about recognizing the human cost of this conflict, the individuals whose lives have been upended, and the choices they're making to navigate this very uncertain terrain.
And that kind of brings us to a question we wanted to leave you with, the listener.
Yeah.
Given everything we've explored, what criteria should be used to assess asylum claims based on political affiliation or religious belief?
Right.
How do we balance those security concerns with humanitarian obligations?
Yeah.
How do we ensure fairness and objectivity in a world where information is often contested and politicized?
It's a question that doesn't have a simple answer, but it's one that we all need to grapple with as we navigate this increasingly complex world.
Right.
It's a question that demands our attention, our critical thinking, and our empathy.
This deep dive might be over, but the conversation, the learning, the search for understanding must continue.
It must.
We hope that this has given you some valuable insights and perhaps even inspired you to delve deeper into this fascinating and important topic.
And remember, as you continue exploring, stay curious, stay critical, and never underestimate the power of human connection and resilience.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.